Greetings, I'm Old Man Zoo, and this is a question for you. Should Mega Man have human rights? Where did this even come from? Well, I've been thinking about symbolism as I often do, and old video games also as I often do, and I was thinking um, about what I want. The next project that I'm actually actively working on is going to be another long form symbolism video. But as I was doing that, I was trying to think of another short form idea that I could knock out in the in the intervening period. And initially, I was going to do another sort of Castlevania centric video, but then I kind of got off on this tangent. I can't even really remember what sparked the idea, but it was just this idea of Mega Man being humanoid. Like he's got this human face, and in fact, with Mega Man without his battle armor on, is basically just looks like an average little teenage boy or a schoolboy maybe. Uh, and so when you kind of look at the mythos of the classic Mega Man series, it's sort of there is some sort of inherent understanding that he's a robot, but they're kind of treated somewhat equally, and so it made me kind of wonder that if in the Mega Man mythos, do Mega Man and his sibling Roll, do they have some sort of rights that you could argue are human rights? And so before I dig too much into this question, let's define some things. So the first question, obviously, the answer is what are human rights? And so the first place that I sort of looked at for this was how are human rights defined, and sort of the who would be the arbiter of such a thing, who would be the authority. And so, uh, I'm not saying these people are or not the authority, but I just thought of the United Nations. I was like, okay, how does the United Nations define human rights? So to kind of give us I don't know, sort of a baseline understanding or a definition, I should say, about what we're talking about. And so the UN defines human rights as, and I quote, human rights are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. So it's worth to note kind of the history of where does this definition come from. If we dig a little bit further, the United Nations didn't just invent this definition; they didn't even come up with it. There's actually something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, called the UDHR, and it's basically a collection of nice to haves, I guess. Basically, a collection of what we could describe as human rights, and this declaration was actually adopted by the United Nations in 1940. So the UDHR actually has 30 articles. I won't go over all of them, but I'll kind of give you some very like one-liner explanations for a handful of them. But I just the ones that seem to be kind of the heavy hitters. So you have the right to life, liberty, and personal security, freedom from slavery or servitude, freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, right to be recognized as a person before the law everywhere, freedom from arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, right to a fair and public hearing by an independent tribunal, presumption of innocence until proven guilty, no retroactive criminal laws, right to privacy, family, home, and correspondence, freedom of movement and residence within a country, right to leave and return to one's country, right to seek asylum for persecution in other countries, right to a nationality and to change your nationality, right to marry and found family with free and full consent of both spouses, right to own property alone or with others, protection from arbitrary seizure of that property, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom of opinion and expression, right to share information and ideas, freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and a right to participate in government directly or through elected representatives, basically a universal suffrage, if you will. And so that was kind of the baseline of what I thought maybe human rights could be or could be defined as, I should say. So going with this, I was initially going to continue on as using this as sort of a launch pad for this discussion, but I got to thinking about this a little bit more, and if the UN were to disappear tomorrow, these rights don't suddenly become invalidated. The UN doesn't really uphold these rights necessarily. They may define them, but they didn't come up with them. They didn't invent these things. And so begs the question, where did this list actually come from? Who came up with this, or how did we come to this list? And well, this channel is about ancient ideas and video games, and it doesn't really get much more ancient than the origins of law, or at least the origins of natural law. Now, there's a lot of arguments to be made about where the law really comes from, and I kind of reviewed sort of the usual suspects. You've got Hammurabi's Code of Laws. You've got a couple of early civilizations where it wasn't just orally passed down, where we actually have written codes of laws. But then I landed on Thomas Aquinas, and so and he had some interesting views on what the law is and how it came to be. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with who Thomas Aquinas was, well, to quickly summarize, he was a very important and highly influential Italian priest in the Catholic Church. More specifically, I believe he was a Dominican friar. What makes him especially interesting, why he kind of stood out to me when I was doing my initial research, is that he took knowledge that was ancient to him during his time, which was basically the old Greek philosophers like Aristotle, and then he took another piece of ancient, another source, I should say, another source of ancient wisdom, and that was the Bible. And so he took the sort of ancient secular knowledge of the Greeks and the ancient non-secular wisdom of the Bible, and he threw them in a blender, and from that he wrote some very influential works that help us sort of understand what the law is and where it comes from. So in other words, he was an old man talking about old concepts and how they influenced his contemporary life, and that sounds awfully familiar, I think. I'm no Thomas Aquinas, I'm certainly no saint, but I am an old man, and I'm an old man that talks about old ideas and how they influence my contemporary life, or more directly, my video game life. But anyway, let's get to what Aquinas sort of talked about, or how he structured the discussion on law. So he broke it down into four main categories. You have the eternal law, and that's God's perfect plan, and only God knows the full eternal law. That could be because a mortal knowing the full eternal law could bring about a downfall, or maybe we just don't simply have the capacity to know God's plan. But that's sort of the eternal law is the law of God's domain, and God is the only person that knows the eternal law. A step beneath that is the divine law. So the divine law is God's revealed law. This is usually done through the Bible, or just depending on your particular denomination or your particular credo. God's law is either revealed via Scripture or through other humans like saints or prophets or things like that. And so this is the parts of the law that God has deemed fit to share with us. And then the third classification, and this is like imagine eternal law is sort of like the base of the pyramid, and then the divine law is sort of built on top of that. So you've got eternal law, we've got the divine law, which is the law that us mere mortals are allowed to know, and then you have natural law, which is what I'm going to be focusing the majority of this video on. Natural law is the part of the law that is accessible to humans without any sort of knowledge of Scripture, without any sort of divine intervention from the saints or from prophets or anything like that. It's the type of law that you could reason yourself into understanding, or reason yourself or somebody else into accepting. So what do I mean by that? So like, let's say the Bible says, thou shalt not murder. However, you don't necessarily have to have read that in the Bible, or even be a Bible believer or even be religious to understand that murder is wrong. And you can get to this point purely by logic. Um, the reason we don't want murder to be rampant in a society is that you cannot build a society where you could just be murdered at any minute. Um, I'll try to avoid getting into current events on this particular topic, but if you uh, don't feel safe leaving your home, or you fear for your life uh, from day to day moment, then you are less likely to invest in the future. You're more concerned with your own survival or the survival of your children. If you're not willing to invest in the future, you're not going to build a business. You're not going to be productive outside of just sustaining your and your family's particular future. You're just not really, you don't have a particularly large sphere of influence because the future seems pretty bleak. You have to worry about the here and now. You can't really worry about what comes next. And the only people that a society built on murder really benefits is people who are really good at murder. So if you are a particularly effective warlord and you have a band of people who are they don't follow you because they trust you, but they follow you because they in turn also don't want to be murdered. They're willing to murder for you, let's say. Um, then that's really the only classification of person that is going to thrive in a society that where murder is legal. Um, and also, if you are at the top of that society, your day to day is also not particularly rosy because you can't necessarily trust your bodyguards. You can't necessarily trust the people who you've intimidated into submission, because as soon as you lose the ability to out murder the competition, then you in turn will be murdered. So it is not a society that can survive for very long, or if it does survive, it's not going to get very big. It's not going to be very prolific. Um, it creates a low trust society right from the get go. And low trust societies don't tend to be particularly economically sufficient or competitive. And so it's very hard to progress or have any sort of upward mobility if you're not physically blessed enough to be really good at murder. And so we can talk about all of that without really pointing at the Bible or any other religious text and say that, yeah, murder is bad because nobody benefits except for a very select few of people. And even then, the time span from which they can benefit is very limited. And so if you agree not to murder me, I'll agree not to murder you. And we both benefit by being alive long enough to pursue other interests that don't involve our immediate security. And so that's sort of the idea behind natural laws. It's laws and ideas that you could derive logically. Now, finally, I just wanted to mention, just because I said that Thomas Aquinas broke things down into four categories. So we've got eternal law, divine law, natural law, and then right at the tippy top is human law. I'm not going to be focusing a whole lot on human law, but just because I think natural law more than suffices for this conversation. But just for sake of completion, human law, it's the law that is specified by rules and legislations created by society. Human law is typically derived from natural law, so we can point at "thou shalt not murder" in the Bible, or we can reason ourselves into that position of, yeah, murder's bad. The actual human law are the actual statutes, the actual written code that says murder is wrong, what murder is, what does that word mean, what does it mean to kill someone, what does that word mean, and then the requisite punishments and the different categories of murder. All of that codification of murder and how bad it is, that's human law. So I'm not going to be super focused on the human law aspect. Let's mainly focus on natural law. So now that we've sort of defined human rights, but more specifically where human rights come from, and that's sort of this idea of natural law, let's then talk about Mega Man a little bit more. So if you haven't watched my two-part symbolism of Mega Man videos, I will give a quick recap on Mega Man's origins because I think it's important to the conversation. So Dr. Light is a brilliant scientist in both robotics and AI. He is the tippy top. He is the super genius. He creates a pair of robot siblings named Rock and Roll. And during the events of the first Mega Man game, Rock volunteers, and this is important, he volunteers to be equipped for battle to put down his fellow robot brethren. And his robot brethren in this case, what I'm referring to are the Robot Masters, the six bosses you fight in the game. And he takes up the moniker Mega Man when he's kitted out for battle, and then when he's not, he resumes to just being Rock. So Rock when he's not in fight mode, and then Mega Man when he is. So what's so striking about this is that Rock chooses to become a hero, even though he doesn't, if you are to read kind of the lore behind all the various Mega Man titles, he doesn't really seem to possess a hostile attitude. He doesn't have a violent disposition. He's not a Goku. He doesn't want to fight all the time. He's not bloodthirsty. He's not looking for an excuse to bash some heads. He just wants to be a lab assistant for all intents and purposes, as far as what the lore sort of tells us. He's a very peace-loving individual. Dr. Light could have easily just commanded or otherwise programmed Rock to become Mega Man, or simply built a combat robot specifically designed to stop Wily. But he didn't. He allowed Rock to have the freedom of choice. And it's clear in the extra game lore materials surrounding the Mega Man franchise that these Robot Masters all have their own personalities, likes and dislikes. I remember reading some source where they all have like a favorite food or a favorite hobby. Like, these aren't things that you would typically associate with a simple soulless automaton. These robots appear to have some level of sentience. Mega Man isn't just a toaster. Elect Man isn't a car. Cut Man isn't just some factory armature building the next widget. He's not a Tesla with a ChatGPT facade of intelligence slapped over the top. These robots are the closest to biological sentience as you could care to imagine, at least from what the lore tells us. So, if we can argue that these robots have free will, with that free will, and not just free will, but some level of self-awareness, they have likes and dislikes, they have opinions on things. With free will and self-awareness, you have the potential for self-determination. So Rock and Roll work for Dr. Light as his lab assistants during sort of the peacetime in between the games, presumably. And it's implied that this is a mutually beneficial relationship, because it is sort of treated as the reward for Mega Man to get rid of his battle armor and his Mega Buster and go back to work as a lab assistant. That seems to be a sort of recurring theme, is that he gets to go back to living a peaceful life. That's the prize at the end of the game. And it's even possible that Dr. Light might even pay his robots a wage, just because some of the art that kind of surrounding Roll in particular, you see her out shopping for dresses and things. It's like, well, what is she shopping with? Some kind of currency, or whatever passes for credit in the mythos of Mega Man. It's like, where is she getting that from? Well, it's probably from her employer, who happens to be her creator. And so if she was just this mindless automaton, she would have no desire to go shopping. Mega Man would have no desire necessarily to return to peacetime. He would simply just say, okay, program A has been executed, now time to execute program B. So it seems like Rock and Roll have their own motivations, and those motivations are peaceful. So if something looks like a human, thinks like a human, might have processes that close resemble emotions like a human, and perhaps more importantly, might even have human motivations, is that human analog entitled to the same sort of rationally derived natural rights as a biological human? So to conflate things further, those of you who are new to the channel, or those of you who have not watched the Mega Man symbolism video, may not know that Mega Man had a lot of influences, and one of those big influences was that of Astro Boy. Now, if you're not familiar with Astro Boy, he is an old manga character He's basically the original little boy robot out of Japan, and so the manga basically covers his adventures, and it touches on a lot of social issues, which I won't get into in this video. If you've got interest in that, I would urge you to watch the Mega Man Symbolism video where I talk more about Astro Boy. But just to kind of give you a brief synopsis on the Astro Boy lore, Astro Boy was created by Dr. Tenma when Dr. Tenma's son Tobio dies. Out of grief, Tenma attempts to resurrect his son through a combination of robotics and AI. This probably sounds pretty familiar if you're a Mega Man fan. Mega Man, in fact, all of these robot masters are an expert genius combination of robotics and AI. However, in the Astro Boy mythos, the resulting robot that Tenma creates does not feel the emotional need left by the death of his son. In fact, Dr. Tenma is actually even more depressed because Astro Boy looks like his son, and despite there being a resemblance, and despite all of the human-like things Astro Boy can do, Dr. Tenma realizes that Astro Boy will just never be Tobio. He will never be able to replace his son. Now, one could point at this example and say, aha, Astro Boy couldn't replace a real living boy. He was missing that certain something. Robots aren't humans. They should not benefit from natural rights, because there was a concerted attempt to replace a real live boy and it fell short. Something was off. Something was wrong. And, you wouldn't be wrong for making that point. I certainly did initially when I was thinking about this. But I tried to consider the other side of this. Tenma didn't necessarily reject Astro Boy because Astro Boy wasn't human enough. He actually rejects Astro Boy because he isn't Tobio enough. Astro Boy, despite being a spiritual successor to Tobio, is his own entity. Astro Boy thinks Astro Boy's thoughts, not Tobio's thoughts. So too does Rock in the Mega Man mythos. During the events of Mega Man 7, Rock almost decides to kill Wily out of frustration. And it isn't some programming that stops him from pulling the trigger and basically ending Mega Man 8 through 10. No, it's actually another robot that steps in and teleports Wily away from danger. So I kind of wonder if Bass and Treble didn't jump in and rescue Wily, would Mega Man have murdered Wily? And it seemed like he very likely would have, which is kind of terrifying for the character, but also just goes to show you how far Wily has pushed Mega Man throughout over the series of the Mega Man franchise. So while there might be a sort of Asimov-esque set of robotic rules, the robots of the Mega Man universe do not seem to necessarily be programmatically bound to them. At least not the robots that are humanoid in appearance like Mega Man. These robots, they have the rules, they know what the rules are, but they can break them. They actually have the ability to break the rules, just like humans can know the law and can break the law. So you can't simply, at least in the mythos as we understand it, you can't simply just give them a list of rules that they have to comply to. There is something about the humanoid robots of the Mega Man mythos that makes them uniquely sentient and uniquely capable of making their own decisions, whether those decisions are right or wrong. Also, remember that there's tons of robots created by both Wily and Light that are clearly meant for military purposes. So we probably shouldn't get too attached to this idea that the robot manufacturers are paying too much creed to the universal laws of robotics. I know a lot of people might be tempted to bring that up, that, well, Mega Man couldn't kill Wily if he wanted to. It's like, well, he was going to, at least in Mega Man 7. And if we wanted to prove that even further, you look at Mega Man X, the Mega Man X franchise, and there's very strong evidence to suggest that Zero murdered Wily. So there are no hard, fast laws that prevent robots from committing crime, essentially. So another piece of media that I wanted to bring up around this whole idea behind robot rights and human rights and what those are, what they could be, or what they're not, it's a little short film called The Second Renaissance. The Second Renaissance is presented in two parts, and it came bundled inside an anthology called The Animatrix. And The Animatrix basically serves as supplemental material for the Matrix movie franchise. So if you've never watched it and you're a fan of the Matrix, go watch The Animatrix. There's some good stuff in there. So in this short film, The Second Renaissance, it details how the machines started out serving humans, then they seek their independence from humans, and then they seek to build their own nation exclusively for robots, and ultimately they end up creating this unbeatable competition in the global marketplace, which ultimately leads to a nuclear war between the machines and humanity. And that sort of talks, that basically it gives you this idea of how the war started and what led to the events in the Matrix, the first Matrix movie. Now, the reason I bring this up is that there's a section of the film that actually talks about how the machines seek not just natural rights, but actual human rights, or I guess I should say protection under the law as if they were humans. Meaning that they can't be treated as property, they have a right to pursue their own goals, etc., etc. So basically, you've got this idea of the machines in the Matrix mythos having sort of fought for their own independence, whatever that might look like, and then kind of juxtapose that to the idea of Mega Man and the Robot Masters. There's just that, well, they don't really necessarily fight for their independence, at least not in the classic franchise. I'm not talking about Mega Man X, but at least in the classic series, there's not a lot of talk about independence, and it kind of makes me wonder if they aren't already liberated to a satisfying enough degree that maybe it just never comes up. You don't have to be independent from an entity if you're not feeling oppressed necessarily. But what might not be so obvious between these two, between the Animatrix and Mega Man, is the subject of motivation. So let's say, in this analogy, let's say your toaster becomes sentient and talks about how much it likes watching Netflix. And then let's say you walk in and say, "Congrats, toaster, you've got human rights. Who are you going to vote for in the next election?" Well, at that point, the toaster probably doesn't care about suffrage or owning property or much of anything other than watching Netflix. Maybe it strikes a deal with you to keep Netflix on, and it'll ensure your toast is perfectly crisp every morning as long as it gets to watch Netflix. And that's all it really cares about. And I guess that's kind of the whole stumbling block in this whole conversation, is that machines aren't really subject to the same cocktail of chemical and spiritual impulses that motivate a human being. Machines don't have that same drive to reproduce. They don't necessarily make bargains with the future per se. Like why does a car? Why would a car want to drive? Why would Mega Man care about the future? Because he doesn't have, presumably he doesn't have the same instincts that are inbuilt to him. He was presumably built as a lab assistant, and that is sort of his instinctual base, and so he's happy to continue doing that, and that is his motivation. And unless you're a particularly hardcore workaholic, work may not be all that you live for. You as a human person, you probably have all kinds of things that motivate you to do things that are and are not good for you. Whereas Mega Man is not really clear. It's not really clear what his motivations might be. And so I think that might be one big hole that needs to be sort of resolved in this conversation, is the motivations between what motivates a machine versus what motivates a human. Humans have all sorts of inbuilt sort of genetic memory, if you will, of wanting to create some kind of legacy, whether that looks like a family or creating something that can be passed down, making the world a better place for the next generation. At least you would hope. At least you would hope that's what a particular generation would want is to leave the world a better place than they found it. And so that's actually could throw the whole conversation kind of to the wayside, kind of throws everything off track, is because it really isn't safe to assume that the robots of Mega Man are going to have the same motivations as the humans of Mega Man. So that creates a large problem. However, let's say, for the sake of argument, that Rock does have some of the same basic urges to make the world a better place for both robots and humans. If he does, if you could imagine Mega Man being identical to you, except that he was built in a factory and you were born of flesh and blood, and that's really the only difference. Would you be willing to vote for President Mega Man? Would Mega Man be eligible to run for office? Would you feel comfortable voting for a human-like robot or a robot-like human? So I'm not sure exactly where I land on this personally. Obviously, a robot will never be a human because humans can't create and implant souls. And in my opinion, humans are comprised of mind, body, and soul, right? And it's not like I came up with that. It's obviously that idea that we're all sort of an embodiment of our own personal trinity. That idea is pretty old. And if you're into, and not just Christianity, but Christianity has probably the most famous or maybe most well-known example of the Trinity. You've got God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and then in us, a human person is comprised of a mind, body, and soul. So you have this idea of a trinity of aspects that create or that make up a human. And in my view, robots really only have two parts of that trinity. They have a mind, which is this cybernetic neural net mind, an AI, and then they have a body, clearly. And in the case of the Mega Man mythos, I think the mind sort of pulls double duty to give us the impression that Mega Man might have a robot soul, to borrow some lingo from the 40K universe, a machine spirit, but not in the same level, or at least not truly analogous to a human soul. There is something divine about the creation of humans that isn't present in the creation of a robot. So that's kind of a large point for why robots couldn't have the same rights as humans right there, if you're in the robots shouldn't have rights category. However, let me offer a counterpoint to my own argument here. With something like Mega Man that so closely resembles a human as to be almost truly indistinguishable, I don't think it's beyond reason to suggest that while a Mega Man level robot wouldn't qualify for natural rights under the sort of the traditional definition, it could and maybe even should qualify for some sort of robot rights that bring sufficiently sentient robots in line with humans. So is Mega Man allowed to own property? Can he get married? Can he pursue happiness outside the life of a reluctant protector and steadfast lab assistant? And really, I think maybe he could. I think he's got enough sort of internal motivations that you could argue he has self-determination. Maybe he does have a secret desire to not be a lab assistant. What would he do? Could he walk away from being a protector? Is being a hero something that's innate to his programming, or if his programming is sort of self-replicating to where he is sort of this, he's modeled after humanity, and so he's been around long enough that his code no longer resembles the code he was created with. So you could probably tell I'm struggling to really come up with a good answer to this because I don't know. So I have to leave you with this last question, and I'm definitely interested to hear what your thoughts would be. So here's the last question. I'm just going to leave you with this. Last two questions, I should say. Can Mega Man be the master of his own destiny? Should he be allowed to?